I'm Scott Smith. I'm the Deputy Director for Afghanistan programs here at USIP. As you know from your program, this panel will focus on elections. What we wanted to do with these two panels is try to link them a little bit. And I think that I had my own questions about how we would do that, but I think Andrew did most of the work for me by asking our panelists, or the previous panelists, questions about elections. And maybe we'll get some issues of reconciliation from this panel, since, as has been pointed out from the previous panel, the issues are interlinked. There's a possibility of, as Steve Kalenda said, a virtuous circle, and there's also a possibility where an unreconciled Taliban, unwilling to allow a new government to have legitimacy, may obstruct elections from happening. And then there are probably any variety of scenarios in between. On a point of logistics, if I could ask maybe to move in a little bit from the aisles, because I think there are people who are coming in who don't find room to sit, and it's more convenient for them to come in and sit on the edges. Without any more introduction than that, let me introduce our panelists. Kicking it off on this session will be Steve Cole, President of New America Foundation, staff writer for The New Yorker, and justifiably famous for his book Ghost Wars, which is one of those few books about Afghanistan that non-Afghan experts have read. And I say that speaking as somebody who's written one of those few books about Afghanistan that even Afghan experts don't read. But I'll give you the link on the website afterwards. Second, Jim DeHart, Director of the Afghanistan Office of the U.S. Department of State, a career Foreign Service officer since 1993, and who also served in the beautiful province of the Panjshir for the U.S. State Department as the head of the only civilian-led PRT, so somebody that has good experience in Afghanistan and that now continues to use that experience here. Our third panelist is Thomas Rutig. Probably has more years in Afghanistan than all of us combined. Co-founder and senior analyst of Afghan Analyst Network, which is a think tank based in Kabul, and should be on everybody's browser favorites for Afghan information, with incisive, up-to-date information, not least because Thomas and a number of his colleagues speak Dari, Pashto, or in the case of Thomas, both. Finally, Scott Warden, Senior Policy Advisor with the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs at USAID. I know him more from his incarnation in 2009 as one of the three international members of the Electoral Complaints Commission that my boss Kai Eide had to appoint. I will spare you the story of how they were selected and appointed, but anybody who looked at that election and who thinks about elections going into the future, I think will recognize the sort of heroic role that the ECC played. And I'm sure that Scott, along with the rest of the panelists, will have some important and useful insights for all of us on how we handle the upcoming election in 2014, which, as we saw from the previous panel, is something that Afghans are looking forward to and maybe dreading at the same time. So with that mixture of dread and expectation, I'll hand it over to Steve for our opening presentation.
Okay, dread and expectation. I'm up for that. I'm just going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes, and I won't address so much the election per se, because Scott's best qualified to do that. I thought I would talk a little bit about the election as a mechanism in a broader political transition. I was out in the region for 3 weeks last month, 2 in Pakistan, 1 in Kabul, so I'm sort of up to date. And I guess I came away from the trip thinking that the election does remain on track as the least bad mechanism for a political transition from this palace-centric patronage machine government to the next palace-centric patronage machine government. I think it seems safe to forecast that the election on election day, if it takes place, will be flawed. And some of the character of those flaws is probably worth pausing and reflecting on as I go along. But apart from the particular ways in which it might produce political problems through its flaws. There's also just a question of scale. How difficult will it be to hold a credible vote? And so let me come back to that. I think the broader political transition that's underway is, in fact, quite vigorously underway right now. I'm sure perhaps the earlier panel, which I'm sorry to have missed for another appointment, may have touched on this. But there is what is commonly referred to as the Afghan primary, very much vigorously underway. Quite a lot of talking and speculating and rumor mongering and negotiating among power brokers, regional leaders, elements of the palace, people who think they're connected to elements of the palace, members of the Karzai family, people who benefit from the Karzai family, people who want to benefit from the Karzai family. And it really is, in some ways, Andrew said this during the break, and I think he was right from his recent visit, it's sort of heartening that this is being taken seriously. There is a very loose and a little bit unsettled negotiation going on, but it's going on, and that would be better than it being ignored. I guess I came away with the sense from meeting with people who are involved in the negotiation, people who are observing it, with the sense that there are some assumptions, none of them firm, none of them especially confidently held, but there's some assumptions about this process, this Afghan primary. And some of them have evolved from what you would have reported if you'd taken a similar sounding 6 or 9 months ago. One of the assumptions is that it now seems to people more likely than not that Karzai will actually go. Now, you can hear lots of different opinions about that, but certainly the median opinion has shifted to the view that he may go. A second, and this is a really important assumption to the character of the negotiations, a second assumption is that he will be pressured, even if he doesn't wish to name a successor to his machine. That there's just going to be too many people telling him that he must designate a successor, even if for legacy or conflict avoidance reasons, he might wish not to do so. A third assumption that I continue to be surprised by, but I shouldn't be. I had lunch with another senior official from the region today, and that person reminded me that this is actually the way it works in this part of the world. There's an assumption that it's quite possible, if not likely, that the successor that he is pressured to name will be a member of his own family. Now, this, of course, seems to us in the technocratic West as unfortunate and problematic, but there is a view up close that, well, it's only going to make explicit what everybody knows, which is that the machine will continue and the machine will be a participant in the election. Maybe people can handle that if the right coalition is built around it. I'm just reporting what I heard. And then a fourth assumption about this Afghan primary is that if the second one is correct, that he will be pressured into naming a successor at some stage, a companion assumption is that he will delay making that decision for as long as it is humanly possible to do. Because there's all kinds of incentives to postpone, including the personal difficulty of disappointing those in the Afghan primary who are not going to be named, and the potential dangers associated with triggering the knowledge that people have been left out if that hasn't been adequately prepared for, and also the practical advantage of trying to swing this machine into an election as close to the equivalent of the Labor Day turn that we just went through as possible. You don't want to spend your announcement and your kind of momentum too early in the process. But nobody knows what that date is. I mean, I asked lots of people, when do you think is the last possible day that he has to drop, that the smoke has to go up the chimney? And you hear lots of different views about that. Some people think he's got to do it by the end of the summer. Some people think he could wait longer. And then there's the question of his temperament and his own decision-making, his own sense of where his interests lie. And of course, it's useful to be reminded on every visit what a hothouse that palace really is, and how intense and cloistered the atmosphere of this kind of decision making. I mean, it's really Shakespearean. And when you have the opportunity to talk to players, you know, little angle of vision about it, the sense of a real palace, of a old Elizabethan type, you know, is very much present in the way people describe their interactions with the president, their sense of what the president's choices are, who are his favorites, who are his rivals. And so you know, whether he's Lear or whether he's something a little more grounded and savvy is kind of the form of the question, as the lawyers say. Now, I'm not a forecaster, and I don't think the history of Afghan politics would give anyone confidence about forecasting a change in the presidential office. I did look backwards and remind myself that 7 of the last 9 Afghan presidents have come to office either through a coup d'etat or a guerrilla or military invasion. So they're the only 2 exceptions that I could think of, Thomas can correct me, were Babra Karmal to Najibullah, sort of under Soviet auspices, and very brief handoff of Mojadidi to Rabbani in the first Mujahideen government. But this would be the first truly peaceful transfer of authority in that power without a coercive or pre-negotiated agreement. And so we have to be humble in the face of that probability, right? It would not be part of the pattern. And I think when you look at, nonetheless, the primary and the negotiations and the talks that are going on, the possibility of an adequately stable and inclusive coalition of power brokers and regional groups, with maybe some deck chairs reshuffled as to who's in and who's out, who's in the official opposition and who's on the inside of the coalition. The possibility of such a coalition forming in approximation before Election Day and then being ratified on Election Day seems to me, you know, it's possible. It could happen. That project does not seem as if it's slipping away. It's being attempted. And there's, I think, a pretty sophisticated understanding among the power brokers and the regional leaders as to what a minimally stable, minimally inclusive coalition that is organized around the palace and various forms of patronage and various people deciding to be in and out, what it would look like. I mean, there is a kind of common conversation of what that would be. There's a question as to how much of that could be negotiated as a practical matter before Election Day. And again, this possibility that Karzai would be forced to name a successor or would feel compelled to name a successor could mess up the form of the coalition building that's going on now, if it were the wrong decision. I just thought I would just tick through a couple of other factors and then return to the sort of Election Day flaws that I mentioned before and their consequences. I think there are some external there is obviously, as always in Afghanistan, external context for this internal negotiation. And one of the factors that seems to me still important is whether or not there will be evidence that a strategic partnership is going to be reached or not as this election approaches. And the reason it's important, I think, is that the sort of intuitive incentive structure to go ahead and compromise for the sake of a minimally stable, if unruly, coalition centered around a palace patronage machine, the reason to compromise and to pursue that is the incentive of further rent-seeking, to put it bluntly. And if there is not going to be a stable strategic partnership on which to rent-seek, then the incentive structure changes. And I don't know whether that means it falls apart. It just changes. The idea that the Kabul government after Karzai will be internationally legitimate, audited and capable of receipt of international aid, supported in the field through enablers for its military, and otherwise a credible member of the international community subject to considerable outside support, that is fundamental to the politics that's going on right now. And if something were to happen in which it were that were thrown into doubt, then I think it would change the incentive structure. That was the impression I had anyway. A second externality, piece of external context, of course, is the neighbors. In Pakistan's case, there was a panel before that. We can leave that maybe for the questioning to some extent. I think the sense now is that, and from the my visit to Pakistan as well, I don't expect political tracks between Kabul and Islamabad, or including the United States, to produce any meaningful explicit agreement before the election. But I do think about anything, including ceasefires or those sorts of things. But I do think it's reasonable to think that the Pakistani government, and particularly the military, might conclude that staying relatively down the escalation ladder through this political transition, which is sort of the way I read their position now, they're not as high up the escalation ladder as they might go. They're not as far down the escalation ladder as Afghans would wish them to be, or that the United States would wish them to be, but they are not, so staying far enough down the escalation ladder to allow a form of this political transition and this election to occur, that's the purpose of this engagement, it seems to me. And there's some of that going on, and I think there's a recognition that it's basically about buying time, and not about the election. We would wish it to be about the election, but I think the Pakistanis see it about buying time. And then, of course, Iran is a factor, probably, the mirror image of the American narrative. The first round of intervention that Iran carried out around the parliamentary and other decision-making around the framework for strategic partnership probably signals the role that they'll play as the election gets closer. I remember a conference some of you may have been at where someone recalled in the last election that the Iranian government had sent over some technical assistance and a kind of technical election advisory team after the 2009 vote in Iran. So the idea was the kind of the perverse skill set associated with fixing elections might end up being one part of the way Iran interacts with its factions in the palace, because of course that's where a lot of its where a lot of its political game is played. So then I guess I just finish with a couple of other thoughts about the idea of a flawed election. It doesn't seem hard to forecast that even in the best of circumstances, the best of realistic circumstances, that there will be, because of security concerns and the fact that Afghan security forces will be placed in the lead to provide polling place security, and that it's hard to imagine, however far down the escalation ladder the Pakistani government and the Taliban stay, it's hard to imagine that the Taliban will permit the election without violence to go forward. They'll certainly want to be heard on election day, and in some measure. So what's the easily foreseeable consequence of that, if I'm approximately right? It means that Pashtun it means voter suppression, as we would say in this country, in Pashtun areas. There will be some degree of voter suppression in Pashtun areas, and then the question will be, how will that fact be addressed? In some circumstances, you might argue it was addressed through fraud by simply casting votes when voters didn't turn up. In other instances, it has produced, of course, distortions, as in Ghazni in that last cycle, where you ended up with a disproportionate number of Hazara candidates winning because of essentially voter suppression. And now, it seems to me the lesson of that is to anticipate it. Some version of that is almost certainly going to unfold, and it's very difficult to manage a problem of that character while also attempting to deliver the freest, most credible, most internationally credible election, because they're sort of different problem sets. But there's no sense going into Election Day with some fantasy that there isn't going to be a structural problem of that character, it seems to me. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, and I hope this microphone is working well enough. Thank you to the U.S. Institute for Peace for organizing the event and for the invitation. It's great to see a lot of friends and colleagues out there, colleagues from the Embassy of Afghanistan, Embassy of Pakistan, and others. We appreciate the event because, and also appreciate USIP's efforts to highlight what is really a very important set of issues. The work you've done has brought more attention to political transition. Political transition, the way that we look at it, is it's more than simply the elections of 2014. But when we consider political transition, we consider the effort to support an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace and reconciliation process. We think about the need for more reform in the Afghan government, by the Afghan government. And then, of course, we think about the presidential provincial council elections of 2014. We think about also the 2015 parliamentary elections, also very important. And I think if there's one thing that we've learned, it's that all of these events and other processes to the economic transition and other efforts are all very closely related. But today I'll focus, as I was asked to do, on the elections and that component of political transition. And I really want to just make 3 points here. My first point, a very simple one, that the elections in 2014 are extremely important. This is a basic, but a point that we need to highlight. Important for Afghanistan's future stability, important for continued donor support to Afghanistan. And so within the United States government, within our system, we're giving this issue the attention that it merits, the attention it deserves. It's critically important. And so this is why you've seen us address political transition, the elections, through the strategic partnership agreement that our president signed with President Karzai last May in Kabul. It's why we've addressed the issue together with the rest of the international community in Afghanistan, also in Tokyo last summer in the Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework, and more recently when Foreign Minister Russell visited Washington for the inauguration of our U.S.-Afghanistan Bilateral Commission, and we addressed this issue again in the joint statement. And so it's a set of issues that are critically important and deserve the high-level attention. Fortunately, there's some good news to report. The Independent Electoral Commission in Afghanistan announced the date of the elections in 2014, April 5th, presidential and provincial council. President Karzai, who has said again and again that he will not stand for another term, he welcomed that announcement of the date. We welcomed it also. The date of the presidential election is constitutional. The date of these elections allows for planning to move forward, for security planning, for the great amount of technical planning and logistical planning that needs to take place. We think it's important also that the Independent Electoral Commission, the IEC, spoke to the importance of women's participation in the elections in 2014. And also notable, too, I think that the IEC talked about the possibility of the Taliban participating if they if they were to choose to do so. So Afghans have made it clear that their aspiration is a free and fair and transparent, inclusive, credible elections in 2014. And our role is essentially to support that aspiration, that Afghan aspiration. And we will provide that assistance. And this really leads to the second point I'd like to make, that this will be fundamentally an Afghan election, an Afghan event. It's up to Afghans to choose their next president. And so I want to be very clear in saying that the United States will not support any candidate or candidates in these elections coming up in 2014. We also recognize that how the elections are run is an Afghan question. It's a question for the Afghan government, for the parliament, for civil society, for the legitimate election authorities, and for the Afghan people. And so our role is one of advice and support and technical assistance. We will take an interest in the process governing the elections and in the institutions that are responsible. Thinking in particular of the IEC, but also the important role that both houses of parliament have to play. And we'll be paying very close attention to the inclusiveness, to the role of civil society, to the role of women in the process. And again here, if we think about this as an Afghan event, I think there's, again, some good news to point to. So what we see happening now is the IEC is very actively working on options for voter registration in the run-up to 2014, and in fact just made an announcement about the start of voter registration later in the spring. There's a couple different sets of electoral legislation that's being debated by both houses of parliament and by the Afghan government, the cabinet. We're seeing a range of political actors, other political figures in Afghanistan engaged in some coalition building efforts, engaged in laying out principles for the elections. And so, for example, the democracy charter that was signed in September of this year. And then some active work by civil society, including the Free and Fair Election Foundation of Afghanistan, FIFA, bringing together political parties, bringing together other elements of civil society in support of a good electoral process. And so this is all important work that's taking place in Afghanistan by Afghans. And I think it shows that they understand, too, the critical importance of this event. And they're not sitting back, but they're getting to work. Finally, the third point I would like to make is that at the end of the day and after the election is concluded, of course, there are going to be a whole lot of assessments on our part by Western observers, by the Western press, I think, about what kind of event this was, what kind of process it was leading up to the vote. But I think in the end, what's really going to matter, even more than the assessments that we have, is the takeaways of the Afghans themselves and the perceptions that Afghans have of these events. The elections in 2014 are going to be extraordinarily difficult and challenging for all the reasons that I think you know. For security reasons, many parts of the country will be difficult to get to the polls. Geographically, it's challenging. Logistically, it's challenging. And we'll be in a period where we're also undergoing Afghanistan is undergoing a security transition at the same time. But the bottom line for these elections will be legitimacy in Afghan eyes. The question will have to be asked, is this an election that Afghans can stand behind? is it an event that Afghans will look back on and say this was inclusive and credible and fair? And if the answer to those questions is yes, then I think that there will be a good foundation to move forward, and Afghans will be better invested in their government and in their system going forward. And that has real benefits across other lines of effort, including peace and reconciliation. And I think also, when you look back at the commitments that international donors have made, for example, in Tokyo, and the commitments that the Afghan government made, and we made together through the Mutual Accountability Framework, credible and inclusive, transparent elections and a good process are going to be key to ensuring that donors come through in the future and follow up on those commitments just as Afghans have followed up on theirs. Afghan perceptions, I think, on the day after the vote are also going to depend a lot on how they perceived the process leading up to Election Day. And between now and then, Afghans are going to want to see clear rules of the road laid out. They're going to want to know that different candidates are playing by the same set of rules. And we see an Afghan-led process of consultation and discussion underway now, some examples I gave earlier, to try to lay out those rules and to lay out that framework for the elections. And building this consensus is going to be a very important process between now and then. So if there's one message that I could leave with my Afghan colleagues and partners today, it would just be to please continue the work that's going on now. It's vitally important, and as you do so, you'll have our continued encouragement and support. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for USIP, for the honor to be on this podium, and I also promise not to speak in Pashto. A couple of thoughts, probably not very coherent because there's so many points actually which should be made even on this more limited issue I've been asked to touch upon, which is what internal Afghan political dynamics are going on in the moment, election-related. But let me just very quickly go back to one which I find very interesting question from the first panel, which is why are there no mass demonstrations in Afghanistan, or why there is no mass movement in Afghanistan? I think that has a lot to do with the framework and the conditions, the environment in which elections in Afghanistan are happening. In Afghanistan, very often things which are contradicted to each other are happening or existing at the same time. And when we look into the political spectrum in Afghanistan, it's at the same time extremely fragmented and polarized. And in a situation where you never can be sure, where you have a couple of dozens of different factions and sub-factions, where you never can be able to say whether they're really with the government or against the government, whether they are in government or opposition. Sometimes they're both at the same time. It's very difficult to go and demonstrate or start a movement, because you never know whether some of your allies probably start sniping at you from behind in a certain situation. Then also I found that term of the 30 years war, which we as Europeans know very well, very convincing, because, I mean, Afghans have been involved in that. Most of them have been fighting or in other ways involved in all these different conflicts, armed conflicts, sometimes on the winning side, sometimes on the losing side, sometimes on both, depending on which time. And if you have survived that, you really think twice whether you want to engage yourself in mass demonstrations or something. So it also has to do something with encouragement. And one thing I'm hearing in Afghanistan from my Afghan interlocutors is very often, why did you bring back these guys who have been responsible for earlier parts of the conflict? I don't want to single out any side here, but I think that's also important, and it touches upon what Professor Amir Yar said, that transitional justice has been sacrificed for for the hope for stability, which then did not materialize. And those people we are talking about now, the different political forces, kind of moving this or that directions and trying to set up alliances and so on, none of them really has come out with one exception and said, okay, we also have been involved in that and we really need to tackle that. On the contrary, they have tried to suppress that and threaten everyone very physically who wants to raise that issue. And we know that there has been this mapping exercise, the kind of putting on paper which crimes have been committed by whom over the past few decades, and it's still not out. The first version, which was in 2004, 2005, never came out, and the next one now is on the table, and all kinds of different factions who actually belong to different political camps in Afghanistan, or in a real unity, try to prevent that from happening. So we should look at these things, or we give that a lot of weight when we talk about elections in Afghanistan. Okay, but let's just pretend for a moment that the elections in Afghanistan are something like elections in our countries and see what's going on there. In the moment I see there are two issues which are very much on the agenda of this pre-election maneuvering. And interestingly, this is mainly brought up by what here usually is called the political opposition. I come back to that term and also who is this a little bit later. One is electoral law reform. We just heard that the framework, the rules of the game for the elections are still not fixed, but the electoral process, more or less, with the announcement of the date, has started. We don't know whether electoral law reform will happen or not before the process really kicks in. And that has been made a rallying point by the political opposition in quite a broad sense, and has also helped somehow that they collude into something more unified than what we probably have seen before. That's the first issue. The second issue was that of the first podium, which is reconciliation. And we have seen that over the past year or so, that also the political opposition, in its very broad range, has really managed to pick up and also probably gain politically by picking up the uncertainties and fears amongst large parts of the Afghan population vis-à-vis a possible return of the Taliban to power, whether it's fully or partially or violently or through a deal. And I'm grateful to Claire Lockhart that she pointed to the fact that just deals of power sharing are very often likely to unravel, and that's also what many Afghans, of course, fear. And what's also interesting in relation with electoral law reform, and I think Scott will say a lot more about that, so I dropped that point widely, is that it also offered the political opposition much more cleverly than the camp of the government opportunity to make inroads in what we usually call civil society, which is a very broad number of different organizations and differently organized and so on. And of course, we should not discard in that respect the voice of the women. There is a broad range of women's organizations, and these are, and despite all other political differences, most of them are really afraid of a comeback of the Taliban. And after all, if there were real elections, I mean, women would have 50% of the vote or something like that. At the same time, not everything is positive, what's going on. At the same time, we also see a trend of a kind of politicization, or should I say, kind of trends of drifting towards different political camps in civil society. We're seeing something coming up which is pro-government civil society, and we see also civil society which is critical of the government, and we should not expect that civil society just as such would be a common voice. It's something very normal because that's the same in our countries, but we very often expect from Afghans that they come with a unified voice and then actually be a factor in any political process. And what's also of concern is that this tendency goes along with a tendency of ethnicization. I mean that you have that kind of like a trend, but not as, you cannot say that in every instance that pro-government civil society tends to be Pashtun while the others are non-Pashtuns. but I also agree at the same time, that's why I'm saying that things which are very contrary to each other happen at the same time. These labels of this is a Pashtun and the Southern Pashtuns do that and the Tajiks do that, that's also a little bit simplistic. We really need to look into what these labels really mean, but I cannot go into that here. What's also very interesting is that the political opposition has used this issue of reconciliation, or better we should say talks with the Taliban, as a rallying point, very strictly against it for a couple of months, but now we see that they have agreed to attend the talks, the upcoming talks in France with government and so on, which have been mentioned earlier here. So despite all the rhetorics, which is sometimes quite a hard line, and there's also a lot of flexibility, and we really have to see what comes out later in the process. Two more issues that influence the primaries, as Steve called it, which is, of course, the successor question, and probably I can come up with a date when someone needs to be nominated, which could be briefly before 16th September of the coming year, because that's when the registration of the candidates starts in Afghanistan, at least when it's up to the Independent Electoral Commission, and we know that the independence very often is only in the name, so that also can still change. So probably the date is still with a question mark. We also, and that has been mentioned, I mean, but we need to remind ourselves that under the current circumstances in Afghanistan, war, insecurity, but also institutional control and institutional takeover when it comes to electoral institutions, are more important than just who goes and votes. Steve has also said that we need to make a difference between how many voters go and vote and how many votes will be found in the ballot boxes. So elections in Afghanistan might sound simplistic. It's not about who is the most popular leader or who has the best program, but it's about who most effectively gathers the votes, not so much the voters by any means. And this is also not linked to any of the political camps. I mean, when we look into the 2009-2010 elections, of course, it was not only the government camp which was involved in that, it was also with the opposition. And that's exactly also proof for what I just said, that if you have control over electoral institutions, it's probably easier to play this card also. But at the same time, in this very fragmented society, with all its regional or local power brokers, I still live in the 70s and 80s and call them warlords and commanders. I think there was an American writer, I forgot who it was, who said, the past never dies. We even cannot be sure whether it's over. So I still use that terminology. And all kinds of political entrepreneurs. I mean, we have really looked into that. There are people in districts and provinces who go to their constituency and collect votes, and then they start thinking about to which side they can sell them. And sometimes they sell them not only once. So we also have to figure in these things. And it probably sounds all a little bit funny, but it's really serious and will undermine legitimacy of the outcome of the elections. And I'm very happy that Jim here just mentioned also the 2015 parliamentary elections, which are very often forgotten. And if we look back again, the parliamentary elections in 2010 were even worse than the 2009 presidential elections. And only really a shortcut, or I mean this sword which cut through the knot which has been established over there resulted in the fact that we have a parliament now. We cannot be sure actually who really won in these elections, and we really need to figure this into. Let me see. There's also a problem, of course, which does not have anything to do with which political forces we are talking about. It's about election security. And when we now see the Afghan elections as a completely Afghan-led exercise, which they, to a large extent, also were the last time, and we have seen the quality, we really also need to be concerned, and that's only one point, but I want to mention it, about the role the Afghan national security forces play in that. The relatively new Interior Minister, Patang, has just said that the ANSF are still factional, so not necessarily pro-government, and it depends very often on who has the say, how different units on the ground in the provinces of the different security forces behave. And we have seen that a lot, for instance, or for example, of the Taliban attacks in 2010 on polling stations in the provinces were actually conducted by people who, in the broader sense, belong to the Afghan National Security Forces, sent by those people who are paying for them very often. And I've been in one area myself, and then I saw how, after that attack of the Taliban and the security forces taking over, the ballot boxes were full afterwards, which have been empty before. And that's not just a single incident. Okay. So basically, still, in the run-up to the elections, it all looks quite pluralistic in Afghanistan with this G20, as they call it in Afghanistan, the 20 political parties and some civil society organizations who came up with a democracy charter and asked or demanded electoral reform and so on. But when we look how these parties are, these are most kind of the successor organizations of the former Tanzim, of the Mujahideen movements, other armed movements like Jumbesh and so on. But most important, still armed or at least capable of mobilizing armed followers. And that makes it so difficult for the Afghan voter really to speak out his or her mind through the ballot box, because on the ground it's those people still who tell them who to vote. And if you really go into these local units where political entrepreneurs or armed people are working, no Afghan voter has the choice to decide for this or that side, because his vote might already been sold. And it's not only about violence, it's also about hope of favors, and a lot is, of course, promised to voters in Afghanistan before elections. And then also it's a question of honor. I mean, we very often talk about honor in Afghanistan, but that's really the case. So if he has promised it to one, then he would probably also stick with it, or she. So I still see here a polarization. I see there's the presidential camp, which is kind of the network and the groups which are centered around the palace, and together with a couple of political parties, but most of them armed. It's astonishingly enough Hezb Islami, the Islamic Party, or at least the wing which is not in the mountains and fighting the same government, although we never can be sure whether that's just two sides of one strategy or two different groups. And we have very often overlooked, but very importantly also Mr. Sayyaf's group in there and a couple of others, who, by the way, are also part of this G20 and have demanded from the president that electoral reform is conducted and also political parties get a bigger share in the system, which also is a signal to the president that the allies he has in the moment are quite unreliable, and that also probably might make it more difficult to think about who successor should be or could be. The political opposition, which has been called the Northerners before, Northern Alliance or United Front, as they call themselves, are now divided also in two different groups. We have a national coalition led by Dr. Abdullah, and we have the National Front, an alliance of Dostum's Jumbesh and parts of the former Shuraya Nazar, with one of the Masood brothers and part of the Hazaras, to make it simplistic, Hezbollah of Muakkaq. And while the coalition is trying to be a constructive opposition in the moment, or projecting itself as that, probably even leaving open the door for a compromise candidate with the presidential camp, the National Front is more on a collision course with the president, and this is mainly about also one thing which can become a contentious issue in the election campaign, which is federalism in Afghanistan. But mind you, I come from a country which is federal, and usually people think Germans are pro-federalism, but we also have to think about what kind of federalism that will be. And with these three figures at the top, it probably will be a kind of warlord federalism, or even worse, if it links up also with interest in in mineral resources in those areas, it might be a mining federalism, actually some little Katangas in Afghanistan. And to cut my too long speech here short, the question about is there any third force, and I think there's a big blank because on both sides of that polarization you have people who are armed or who at least can mobilize military force. And the one group or party, Rights and Justice Party, which has been founded a year ago or so, is the element closest to a third force, which also would go for a reformist and human rights agenda. But the thing is, in Afghanistan, we usually go back to the 70s and 80s and talk to those people who have played roles then and do not allow other people to come up just by our own neglect. But I think if we really want to have a choice for Afghans and 30 million Afghans or whoever they are, have almost 30 million different opinions, and it's not represented by those two poles, the South Pole, which is in power, and the North Pole, which wants to come into power. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and fellow panelists for including me and this good forum. So many good things have already been said about elections. I'll try to be brief to allow for questions and comments. I think that Jim has already framed well the election issues and the U.S. government's overall perspective on supporting the Afghan election process. I was just in Kabul last week following up on election issues, so I can give some of my personal perspective on what I was hearing and seeing there in terms of election preparations that are underway. And I'll also talk a little bit at the end about what USAID is doing and planning to do to support the election process. It's already been stated, but I want to underscore as well that it's clear that already more attention is being paid to elections much earlier than either of the past two cycles in 2009 and 2010. And I think this is an excellent development. The process is complicated. The flaws are well known. I think that the only, sure way to try to address them is talk and lots of time for talk. And the more time the political parties have to analyze their situation, analyze the rules of the game, negotiate compromises of them, also to work through the Afghan primary process, as Steve referred to it, as all that time spent on those negotiations is for the better for the process. We have already mentioned 3 key decisions or discussions that are underway now on election decisions. One is the announcement of the election date, again happening quite early, in line, actually ahead of schedule for when the Afghan government had initially promised to announce an election date, ahead of the Tokyo Declaration's timetable, and that's a very positive development. Also, there's the debate going on in the IEC and the ECC structure law. What will be the mandate, the composition, the selection criteria for those key institutions, combined with a debate about the electoral law, the law that governs the more specific rules that elections are conducted by. Those are both in Parliament now, or one has been in Parliament for several weeks, and the other, the election law, is on its way. This will give the Parliament a chance to perform its rightful role in the process of deliberating what are the election rules, bringing in a consensus process. We also have decisions over voter registration that are coming up for decision soon. Voter registration has been a contentious issue in the past. It's well known that there are 17 million voter registration cards in circulation. There's an estimated 12 million voters. That discrepancy is partly due to people who have passed away, due to duplicate registrations, but there's also a credible number of fake cards in that mix. And Afghans want some kind of solution to know that the voter register is more credible for future elections. And the IEC is working on a plan for that. These 3 things are all fundamental building blocks of a fair election process. And again, to have them debated early and have time to sort out a consensus answer to how these will be decided is important. I think also it's important to note that there's a interrelationship between technical election decisions, as I might call them, on these key issues, the election laws, the selection criteria, voter registration, and the political discussions. And I think that Afghan parties don't necessarily know technical election standards, as practiced in the rest of the world, but they intuitively understand how an election rule will affect their ability to get out the vote. And there are there are fair and unfair ways to set the rules so that people have an equal opportunity to participate. And so I think that, again, having this debate open, robust, and early allows Afghan parties, stakeholders in the process, to calculate what does this mean for my constituency, for my ability to get out the vote, and then how can I negotiate a solution that is balanced to give Afghans a relatively equal chance of participation. In terms of looking at past Afghan elections, there are obviously numerous flaws, and I think there are three key areas that need to be addressed to improve legitimacy of the process for the 2014. Those three are, first, the independence and credibility of the electoral institutions, in particular the IEC and the ECC, or whatever complaint mechanism is decided. Second is inclusive participation, and in particular, looking at two underrepresented populations at the ballot box in past elections, which are Pashtuns in insecure areas in the south and the east, and also women, particularly in rural or more conservative areas. The third category is better fraud mitigation. In each of the past two elections, 2009 and 10, 1.2 million ballots out of 4 million plus initially cast were thrown out for fraud. It's a tremendous percentage, and it's a huge volume of fraud. And when you have to throw out that many votes, it puts enormous pressure on the electoral institutions who are trying to control the process. I think it's been stated many ways already how important the 2014 elections are. The political importance of that event puts even more pressure on electoral institutions. So comprehensive fraud mitigation is a way to diffuse political tension and allow the electoral institutions to deal with it, manage the credibility of the results process. Let me talk a little bit more in depth on each of these three, and then I'll conclude with what Usaid is doing to support the process. In terms of independence and credibility of the institutions, I think it's clear that the Afghans' trust in the process depends on their trust in the institutions that are running it. And I think several of the hallmarks that are being discussed in Kabul now of credible electoral institutions is to have them be independent of government. How do you achieve that? Well, there needs to be a consensus process, a consultative process, and then a consensus process on who the nominees are. The Afghan parliament has put forward a proposal in their draft laws to have checks on the president's power to nominate IEC appointees. In the past, all Independent Election Commission appointees have been direct appointments of the president. This is obviously a hotly contested political issue. I think it's, again, important for these bills to be debated in Parliament, which they are, and for the Afghans to come up with some credible mechanism that allows different groups to have a say in who represents the electoral process in the institutions. The representatives themselves obviously need to be well qualified. I think that one of the encouraging things that I've seen following elections since 2005 in Afghanistan is how there really has been, despite the flaws in the process, there has been an incredible capacity building within the IEC, particularly in the Secretariat, but also of other stakeholders in the process, learning time and again how the democratic system is supposed to work. So I think that there are well qualified individuals, and Afghans will recognize those that understand elections and those that don't. All that said, of course, this is an Afghan decision as to what process is ultimately adopted for nominating the individuals to these institutions. I think that, though, it is important for us to follow the legal process of Afghanistan and the legislative process in particular, to have a law that winds up having majority support through the legislative mechanism that can govern these elections. The second point on inclusive participation, as I said, Pashtuns in insecure areas where there is legitimate restrictions on access to the polls for security reasons, and women where there are a number of cultural as well as security obstacles have been underrepresented in the polls. You also have, as Steve mentioned, the potential of the Ghazni problem. So if you have limited access that falls along ethnic lines, so in Ghazni you have a province that's roughly split between a Hazara population and a Pashtun population. The Pashtun population is less secure, so fewer people got out to vote. As a result, all 11 seats in Ghazni of the parliamentary seats went to Hazaras. This is potentially a national problem when you're talking about a single constituency for presidential elections. So there has to be some way to get out the vote in more equitable form. A lot of this is a security issue, of course, and that's difficult to tackle. But I think that, what a lot of people are focusing on in Kabul is public outreach, particularly to the communities that have been underrepresented, and inclusive voter registration, making sure that whatever system is adopted, people that are willing to take risks to go to the polls, that are willing to stand up to support Afghan democracy, can actually cast their ballot on election day. A combination of voter outreach and inclusive rules will help to increase participation. Another figure that I think is worth monitoring and being concerned about is the overall participation in the election, regardless of which group comes out and is represented. In the 2004 initial presidential election, roughly 7 million voters cast ballots, whereas in the 2010 election, it was down to about 3.5 million. Afghans, particularly at the IEC, the Independent Election Commission, are concerned about the absolute number of Afghans that get out to vote. And again, I think that the political debate that's going on now hopefully is an encouraging one to Afghan voters, but one way or another, more Afghan voters have to see the process as credible and legitimate, so they come and participate in it, so that the resulting elected officials have more legitimacy. In terms of fraud mitigation, I think Steve put it, better than I could in terms of this tension between having a perfect election, technically, and then also having sufficient participation because of the legitimate obstacles to access. So there needs to be a balance between, rules that might guarantee that you have, full registration and rules that might restrict access to the process. At the end of the day, I think what I was hearing in Afghanistan, and I think, again, some of the other commenters have reflected, Afghans understand the problems that they're facing in terms of running elections for security, literacy, and logistics reasons. They're not seeking a perfect process, but they're rather seeking a balance between, international standard practices and an election that accurately reflects the majority will of the people. And I think that balance, making sure that the rules are in place that apply equally to all parties and there's not a free-for-all in terms of fraud in any particular area of the country is what Afghans are looking for. In terms of specific methods, a lot of discussion has been made about voter registration recently, particularly in Afghanistan, because this is nearing a decision. I think that is, good voter registration is one way to control fraud, but there are many others that are worth investigating. I'll name several just as a list. One is better IEC staff vetting and training. It's an uncomfortable but basic fact that mass ballot stuffing cannot occur without a complicit or corrupt or threatened IEC official. The rules simply do not permit ballot stuffing, and where it does occur, that there's been some kind of breach in the process. And the IEC, I think, recognizes this and is seeking ways to correct it. One statistic that stood out from my experience in 2009 to illustrate the problem is that there were 400 polling centers and 23 districts where, according to the investigation on fraud, more than 50% of the ballots were fraudulent. That shows a problem with the electoral controls that needs to be corrected. Other approaches to fraud mitigation, better ballot allocation that reflects accurately the population in given districts, better monitoring is a huge fix for the process. I think that it's been demonstrated over past elections that more fraud tends to occur where there is both less security and less independent observation. I heard one interesting statistics when I was out in Kabul that the IEC registered 300,000 candidate agents and independent monitors for the 2010 elections. However, they only were present in 40% of the polling stations. That can be for a variety of reasons, logistics, organization, plus security. There are a lot of observers, people that want to participate in observing the process. Making sure that they are organized and have eyes on the process everywhere is one way to improve it. And then also, I think, just better transparency of the results overall. Thomas alluded to some of the problems. The IEC has been very good at releasing preliminary results on a station-by-station basis, which is an international standard practice. The question is, what happens to those results and how do they get adjusted? I think there are many valid adjustments that have occurred, but it's difficult to communicate to candidates as well as to the public how and why those adjustments are made. And I think that's another area that the IEC is looking at to improve their process. Again, the overall goal is to get a reasonable reflection of the will of the voters in the results. Let me just say a few words on what Usaid, U.S. government really, but mostly through USAID's mechanisms, is doing to support the process. As Jim said, this is an Afghan-led process, and we're not supporting any individual candidates. We're rather helping the Afghan institutions and the Afghan political stakeholders with support to participate according to their rules. Our international assistance has been heavy for each of the past 4 elections. It will continue for 2014. We do have an eye towards sustainability in the future. Each Afghan election has cost for the administration in the ballpark of $100 to $150 million. That's a large amount of money for the Afghan government to sustain, and I think working together with the Afghan government, we need to find ways to make the costs more sustainable. The process is Afghan-owned and led. You have to look to issues of procurement and hiring being Afghan-owned and led to bring costs down. So we're looking at supporting the 2014 elections as robustly as we can to make it successful, but then also to make it more sustainable for Afghanistan after 2014. There are several areas of support that we plan to provide. We don't have budget figures because the Afghan government is still processing their estimates and their requests. But in terms of categories, we're working with other donors to do direct support, support to the electoral institutions through a UN mechanism with other donors. So funding the IEC for its operations, for the surge capacity that is needed for the 2014 elections. We're also supporting civil society and observer groups. I already mentioned the importance of them. This will again be to fund their monitoring efforts to the extent that it's needed. Separate but related from that is capacity building and training for political parties, political entities. This is something that we've done consistently in Afghanistan, not as a matter of political advocacy, but rather to build their understanding for how a democratic process worked and build their capacity for organization and their ability to participate in it. And then finally, in terms of outreach and participation that I mentioned, I think we're really kind of focused on 3 areas where you can have a lot of improvement. And Claire Lockhart mentioned one of them earlier, the importance of youth. Her statistic was what, 75% under 25. There is, whatever the numbers, there's obviously, a huge emerging, newly 18 and people that will be 18 for the 2015 and 2019 election cycles. They need to be engaged in the process. They need to understand it. We're seeking ways to work with youth organizations to build their understanding of participation in democracy. The other 2 areas are women in terms of their participation, and media as a essential component to getting voter education out there, to increasing participation with youth, women, as well as other constituencies. So together we're working with the donor community and with the Afghan government, in particular the IEC, to coordinate our efforts so that all aspects of the process can be supported and there can be a robust election in 2014.
Thank you. Okay, thanks to all of our panelists. I think we have about 15, maybe 20 minutes for some questions, so there's a lot of rich material there to expand on. Yeah. There's a microphone coming your way.
My name is Rufus Phillips. I was a volunteer with FIFA during the 2009 election on my own hook. And I have some observations I'd like to make which I think are relevant.
But brief.
Yes.
Thanks.
And I want to ask a question. The observations are the following. I found that the U.S. government, which was putting up the money for this election, and it made lots of declarations very similar to what I hear now about what we want to see, was nevertheless very reluctant to become involved to the degree, and I don't mean openly, to actually influence the course of events during this election. In other words, we said, well, we're all for this, but when it came down to specific acts that we could have undertaken, I'll give one. We certainly knew that that the kind of violation was going to occur with these ghost ballot boxes. We could have let the word out that we were going to send drones out to observe those election places, and we didn't. Now, you say this is interference, but it's interference for what? It's not interference for the United States. It's interference on behalf of the Afghan people. And that was something that I saw in FIFA. FIFA felt like it was an institution out there all by itself with very little moral support from any quarter. And certainly, if we expect these elections to come out half decently, we have to think about the fact that not putting our thumb on the scale is just the same as putting our thumb on the scale. And so I would like to know whether, in fact, all of this activity I hear is just in the declarative stage, or whether we are actively working with Afghans to encourage some of these developments.
Any other questions? Yeah. We'll take two more here, and then Thomas, did you have a question? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. My name is Michael Harsh. I'm with SAIS. I wanted to make an effort to link the two panels and ask the panelists, how do you think will the upcoming elections affect the prospects for talks or reconciliation? To be a bit more specific, what do you think? Do you think that the Taliban are concerned that the 2014 elections might actually produce a more legitimate president than Karzai is, and as a result that the Taliban's negotiation process might become weaker post-election? Put differently, do you think that the Taliban might be interested in striking a deal before the elections, or do you think that's just fiction or wishful thinking?
And there's a question in the back, I think.
Hi, I'm Nasrin Gross. I'm a women's rights activist in Afghanistan. And since 2005, I have participated in giving information as like seminars to women candidates and also women who are eligible to vote. And my experience has been that one of the worst problems in Afghanistan is mobilizing women voters. And I know that Jim DeHart and Scott Warden mentioned them, and the other two panelists also mentioned a little bit. What I'm trying to get at, to ask maybe Jim DeHart, is this kind of mobilization is something that no political party or political group is capable of in Afghanistan. And if we want to really help democracy in Afghanistan, are we going to support this kind of mobilization? And I don't mean it a week before elections. They need to be way in advance, because in two elections, I went to American NGOs or organizations and offered them my own seminars, and would you believe it that 3 days before the elections, they didn't have the facilities contract in place as to where to hold the seminars. So we really need to get them started, and I hope, Jim, the answer is yes.
Thank you for the question. Maybe we'll just go through each of the panelists and they can respond. There's only one specific question to Jim, but I don't know if anybody, do you want to take a first crack on maybe the Taliban?
The reconciliation one is the one that I might address. I don't think that there's much prospect that a deal relevant to the election can be struck with the Taliban before 2014. I'd be shocked if such a development occurred, pleasantly, but shocked. The other form of your question was whether the Taliban might see the government that emerges from this election as more legitimate or sort of relevantly more formidable as an obstacle to their political participation or their revolutionary aims. I'm doubtful about that too, but I do think the political transition is important to the future of reconciliation in a broader sense. If out of this transition emerges a similarly flawed but stable Afghan state that shows no sign of losing control of major cities and has the financial support of the international community in some durable way. In other words, if the result of this election is the prospect of more military stalemate, then I think both Taliban leadership and the government of Pakistan might continue along the tentative track that they've started, seeking forms of political settlement in lieu of military victory.
Oh, well, maybe I could just begin with the question concerning the link between the elections and reconciliation. You know, what will the Taliban do? What will be their calculation? I think we don't know. I think what we're trying to do is sharpen the choice for them. And so we've laid out clear red lines, clear outcomes, including the severing of ties to al-Qaeda, international terrorism, laying down arms, respect for the Afghan constitution, including for the rights of women. And we've laid these out, as has the Afghan government, the international community, as necessary red lines. And then we've held out the opportunity for them to engage in a peace process with the Afghans, of course, as an Afghan-to-Afghan conversation. And we'll keep working to try to support the Afghan government in getting that started. Now, will the Taliban see any advantage in participating in the elections in 2014? You know, with these red lines in mind, it's possible. It's possible. I don't know that. I don't know that will happen. It's also possible, as a lesser step, I suppose, that the Taliban could decide it's in their interest, perhaps, if not to participate, at least not to work to disrupt, which could be another possibility. But I think the truth is we simply don't know, but we'll keep working in support of Afghan-led reconciliation. On the question of women's mobilization, of course, there are huge challenges to Afghan women's access to the polls. We are involved in this conversation in an encouraging way to Afghan institutions. It's why I cited at the beginning the very important statement that the IEC made, that, of course, the participation of women in the elections is so important, and we thought that was a very good thing. I think, you know, certainly our role is not going to be to mobilize, but will be to encourage Afghans to mobilize. This will have to come from Afghan institutions, I think, and Afghan civil society. There are some things that we can help with. Training of female polling workers, for example, is something that's going to need to take place to assist with access to these sites. But I think our role in this is going to be to encourage and to continue to offer the support that we can to protecting the gains of the last 11 years in Afghanistan, and particularly the rights of women there. And then, Mr. Phillips, I think I have your name right, sir. First, I would say that FIFA, I think, has played a tremendous role, and has and organizations like FIFA have a great role to play in the next elections, where observation, Afghan observation in particular, is going to be so important to address the serious concerns about fraud that are out there. But as I think about transition and the phase that Afghanistan is now in, and the Afghan desire, I believe, to take greater responsibility for their own affairs, and we are now in a new phase, I think, where we have to think in terms of our support for Afghan solutions and Afghan processes. And I think with Afghan approaches, that's where sustainability comes in. And so I think that's the position that we're putting ourselves in now. We will, of course, as I said earlier, have a very strong focus on the electoral process, on the institutions, and to try to be supportive in that way. But I think with Afghan sovereignty comes Afghan responsibility, and this is consistent with transition as it's proceeding.
Very briefly to Michael's question, I would share Steve's shock if there would be an agreement before 2014, but nevertheless, I hope that we more consistently and really seriously work towards achieving progress on that. Otherwise, the Taliban are not in electoral policies. We should not expect that they say, okay, we like your process so much and we are now a political party and put forward candidates. But nevertheless, at the same time, there might be candidates who have links with the Taliban. We had that in the former parliament. One of these gentlemen was killed later from one of the central provinces. And also there might be candidates who really represent those districts where the Taliban really have a constituency and an influence, because in some of the southern areas, I mean, they do not only represent external forces, as some people would prefer it. I found Mr. Phillips' comment very important. In the moment we see the tendency in Afghanistan that a lot of things are presented as foreign conspiracy theories when people want to do something against corruption, for clean elections and whatever. But I mean, it's very, very clear that there are large parts of the Afghan population who want a non-corrupt government and who wish clean elections. I mean, we saw the enthusiasm during the first elections. I mean, that has died down, but probably it can be revived. But that really needs us to make a point about that and not concentrate just on the technicalities of it. And I have a question, actually. In your presentation, you have not mentioned the decision of the Afghan cabinet to abolish the ECC. I mean, what do you think? Is that a good thing, or is that an Afghan matter and we should not interfere? Or sorry,
well, I don't want to go out of turn. So do we want to?
The one most qualified to answer the question.
Yeah, conflict of interest. Can I plead the fifth? Let me answer the other two questions that are relevant. No, I mean, I already commented in terms of election complaints. I mean, there needs to be, for the good of the process, an electoral complaints mechanism that has clear rules and that the Afghans agree with. You know, and I think this is an evolving process. You know, I believe that the election law has just gone, that you're referring to, that proposes to abolish the ECC and create an alternative mechanism. I believe that's just gone to the parliament, or it's about to go to the parliament. Obviously, that will put two competing laws before that body at the same time. And again, I think there's an opportunity and time for a robust debate on that. There's obviously clear preferences across the political spectrum, but that's the right forum to handle the issue. In terms of observation, you know, as Jim said, that's a critical component of the elections. It needs to be Afghan led and run. You know, I think there's actually a huge opportunity, both in terms of observer groups like FIFA, that being the largest, but also with political parties or political groupings, whoever puts forward coalitions of candidates, to, you know, increase the sophistication and the organization of their observation to make it more effective, to make it be a real check on the election institutions, which is part of a healthy electoral system. You know, drones are one way to monitor who's at the polls and access. Obviously, in particularly insecure areas, observers will have trouble accessing. But in the vast majority of areas, you know, observer groups with cell phones can do the exact same thing. With cell phone cameras, with GPS tagging, with interlinked databases. I mean, there's a number of technologies. This is you know, not a panacea just to have technology and cell phones, but there are a number of countries that are conducting elections that have very well integrated reporting mechanisms where observer groups, again, and political parties can instantly report what they're seeing, can aggregate those statistics, and then can put tough questions to the electoral institutions, the IEC in particular. You know, we photographed these people doing this thing here at this particular polling station. Let's compare that with the results there, and is there an anomaly? I mean, that is part of a healthy observation process, and in a lot of the country that can go on, but you need to have greater capacity in the organizations to understand how to organize. Building that capacity is something that internationals can help with, but doing the work and coming up with the plan is something that the groups themselves need to do. In terms of women's participation, mobilizing women's voters, you know, I think it's particularly important, again, for the women's networks, but also for political parties, for the interested political entities to come up with effective ways on their own to do this mobilization, recognizing all the challenges. You know, I thought it was an interesting statistic coming out of the 2010 election. As you know, there's a women's quota, a minimum quota for female parliamentary seats. And it's interesting, and there are a tremendous number of candidates that run for each seat, but there tends to be far fewer women running than men. And in many provinces, if you look at the ratio of candidates to available seats, men for the open seats and women for the female quotas, the odds of women winning as a woman are far greater. You know, you'll have 9 candidates running for 3 offices rather than 100 candidates running for the remaining 5 or 6, for example. This creates a clear, practical incentive for political parties or whoever's putting forward candidates to get women as candidates, and to the extent that women support female candidates, to get women out to vote. You know, this to me is the more sustainable, you know, rationale for Afghan entities to engage women in the political process for real practical political gains. When it comes to actually mobilizing the vote, I mean, I won't just assume, and it's not true actually based on the numbers, that, you know, women support female candidates, men don't. However, you know, in terms of looking at where are you going to get more votes for your candidate, one of the interesting things, again, of the parliamentary election results is that you see just how few votes it takes to win and how few votes overall winning candidates get. So if I remember correctly, for example, 2 of the most popular candidates in Kabul, Kanuni and Sayyaf, each were elected to parliament with something like less than 9,000 votes in Kabul. You know, if you want to defeat a candidate that already has a strong following and you look to where am I going to get the vote out, and then you would naturally look to underrepresented groups at the polls and you say, okay, I can easily pick up 500 women's votes just by doing basic mobilization efforts. And, you know, that sense of competition among all parties winds up increasing participation across the board. You know, I think that, you know, looking to kind of mathematical logic like that and integrating it into the political system is, you know, an interesting way to go about trying to increase participation, you know, in addition to capacity building, but this is kind of something that can be naturally replicated by political groups. So I'll throw that out there as some possibilities. Not saying that you know, the training isn't important, but, you know, there's some political, you know, fundamental political logics that I think also support better observation as well as better women's participation.
Can I just chip in one sentence? Sorry for, I think a lot of the fraud in the last elections has been done in women's polling stations. We also need to be conscious of that.
Well, I guess we'll take one more question and then 2 more. And then that's it.
Thank you, sir. This is Kadir Amiria. My question has 2 parts. One of them, the first one is the recent changes in the government or decision of the cabinet that delegates some authority to the Supreme Court from the Independent Election Commission, or the Election Commission. Independent is redundant there anyway. Now, the other part of it, the second part of it is, I didn't get the impression of what is the whole process. What do we mean by the entire process in this effort of achieving what by election? If we mean by election that delegate of authority to legitimize the government or that 3 branches of government or the executive part of the government or legislative, that is fine. But from what I'm hearing, it's merely looks like a ritual, performance of certain ritual of putting ballot to a box, irrespective of the consequences. to the people, to the average people of Afghanistan after 30 years of suffering, misery, and pain. Thank you.
Okay, I think I think we have to close it there because it's getting later.
I asked this question once before the first presidential election, and Ashraf Ghani laughed at me, so I might as well do it again. Why not cell phone voting? I think that you can address a lot of issues that are, including fraud, by going in that direction.
Is it short?
Yeah, I think everybody would agree that for holding elections, right condition is important. So we should have right conditions. And as you have all mentioned that we have a lot of problems, there are a lot of issues. What can we expect? One thing, and what kind of election would be acceptable for international community and United States? And the second thing is, I didn't see any talk about alternatives. I mean, if we are not going to have elections or if there are problems, so are there alternatives? Because if you talk with Afghans, basically you will jump to alternatives. You will say, okay, election is not possible, so we will go to alternative ways. So what would be alternatives? What are the alternatives?
Should we just start again with you, Steve, and going back down the table?
Well, I mean, there are, of course, alternatives in the Afghan constitution. The question is what sort of result, what kind of alternative outcome would they produce? Would it be more unstable, less likely to attract international commitments and support? So you could have the president invoke various emergency powers as the palace describes them and hold jirga. That would be a possibility. I think that would be a bad outcome. And I think if the security conditions require some mechanism for, the credible postponement of elections, but the promise of them, that would probably be a more likely alternative. I think, however, for the international community under Tokyo and lots of other commitments to maintain its support for the Afghan state as currently described in the Constitution, a successful election, a credible election, is a very, very high priority, as everything that's been said during this afternoon reflects. I just take note, you asked what would be good enough for the international community, and Jim emphasized that from the State Department's perspective, what matters is what's good enough for Afghans. I take that as a declaration of U.S. policy. It's an entirely credible statement. But there is another question, which was what would the international community think? I take note that where the international community thinks it has very high stakes in a divided, violence-racked, but developing country's political future and stability, it is willing to muscle its way through very flawed elections. I would cite Nigeria as an example. The international community has not walked away from Nigeria, notwithstanding the fact that Nigeria, has really lousy elections one after another involving armed gangs, violence, and lots of other flaws. Now, no credible official of the United States government is going to endorse such a possibility, but the realists among us would observe there's a sort of chicken and egg relationship between the quality of an election, the degree of inclusion that occurs even in a flawed process, and the stakes that the international community actually sees in the politics of that country. And so I think there's space here for something that Afghans and the international community can work their way through in the hope that there is a horizon beyond this election that's a little brighter than the one we see in 2014.
Right. Well, sir, I think I can answer your question at the same time that I answered Thomas's question, because I think, in fairness, I owe you a response as well. But I think when we think about the Electoral Complaints Commission, the debate that's happening about that, I think from our perspective, we would just think that, it's important for Afghanistan to have some credible mechanism to adjudicate allegations of fraud and complaints about fraud. Now, what that precisely looks like is really more a discussion, I think, for Afghans to have, and it could look. There would be, I think, probably more than one option for that. And I would add, by the way, that the proposal for international observers on the Complaints Commission was not an American proposal or a United Nations proposal. It was an Afghan proposal, and that's an idea that continues to get some discussion there. I would also just make the observation that bodies that are created or rules that are set down are generally stronger if they're done through a process of consultation and with some transparency and with the involvement of Parliament and with the involvement of civil society. And so I would just make that as an observation. I think it goes to your point, sir, that voting is more about, in this election, is more than putting a ballot in a box. But I think as we consider the kind of consultation that is underway now in Afghanistan and will hopefully continue and strengthen and involve the different institutions that have a responsibility for these elections, that's a very important process. And that helps to strengthen, that's a process that helps to strengthen and protect the gains that Afghanistan has made. Now, on the question of cell phone voting, I'm going to let Scott take that on because I know his answer will be much better than mine. And to the question of what kind of election would we think is acceptable, I would go back to my point that, of course, our assessments will matter because our Congress and parliaments of our NATO allies and partners will take away their own conclusions from the election. But again, ultimately, I think the most important conclusion will be that's taken away by Afghans. And do Afghans feel invested in their government and invested in their state at the conclusion of these elections will be the most important thing. And what if it doesn't happen? It's hard to get a U.S. official to answer a hypothetical, so I won't start. Only to say that we think that a credible, transparent, inclusive election seen as fair by Afghans is possible, and so that's what we'll keep working in support of.
Well, first, thanks for the answer. So I see that probably the discussion is not over, but of course it's a little bit one-sided in Afghanistan because the checks and balances between the three powers in Afghanistan are not even. I try one on the cell phone voting. Under conditions where a lot of the districts are not safe, probably a few people would get the chance to vote how they want to vote. But as what has happened with the simple on-paper election cards, many of the cell phones or what you need to know, the cards, is that what they're called in English, the SIM cards, sorry, will be collected by these local entrepreneurs and people who have the power, and it will not be a real vote. I think it doesn't make a big difference between the paper and the electronic form. It's about security and access anyway. But I'm looking forward to your answer also. On the other two questions, I kind of more or less the same thing, which elections can be expected and what would be acceptable for the international community, but also for Afghans. I have the feeling that when I look at transition, which had been in the beginning conditions-based, we withdraw or partly withdraw in 2014 if this and this and this has happened, and not many things really have happened, and it has just become the date we're going home, full stop. The threshold or the bar we would probably put in front of Afghan elections would be quite low. And we probably, for the sake of being able to say, yes, we can go home with good conscience, we will have another competition like after the last elections of people congratulating the courageous Afghan people, and they are courageous, no doubt about that, for their participation in the vote, which really sounds like cynicism to those people who either with a cell phone or with a voter card have not been able to cast their vote. And there was a small movement which never took off like in Iran, who stole my vote in Afghanistan. I think that could potentially be a mass movement, but people, we will see whether they muster the courage if that happens again. I hope we put the bar not too low just to justify that the course we have decided about, that we can present that as the right one, because I have my doubts about that, obviously.
Just quickly on 2 points. On the cell phone voting, I mean, it's not my area of expertise either, but, you know, I see a lot of technical challenges to that in the short term, and I'm not sure where it's been done successfully elsewhere. Apart from stealing SIM cards, you also have, you know, if you want to take out a cell phone tower in a district, then you wind up having no voting for that election. So I think there are a lot of technical obstacles in the short term. However, you know, I think the spirit of that is useful in exploring further, which is in terms of how do cell phones and other forms of electronic technology help improve the process. I mentioned already observation. I've heard, for example, of a pretty nifty system where IEC officials can have a parallel vote tabulation where they report it by cell phone into a central database to get an instant count, which is then backed up by the paper copies. You know, there are, I think, new technologies that would help improve the integrity of the process, even if it's not casting a ballot formally by cell phone. Also, there's a question that I hope I got it right, but I interpreted to mean, you know, what does this whole process mean for Afghans? And it's something that I want to comment on anyway. You know, I think that, again, with the time and attention that we have early in the process, 18 months or more out, previous voter education and outreach has been focused on how to vote. You know, posters about, okay, you go here, you get this card, and then you put a ballot in the box. Less attention has been paid on why to vote. What does it mean for the overall system? I think there's an opportunity in time to focus on that. And I think that the Afghan primary, so-called, also kind of naturally focuses people's attention on the importance of politics. You know, having elections mentioned early as the mechanism by which you're going to have this momentous presidential succession. You know, hopefully the only kind of full peaceful transfer of supreme power of the government. You know, that captures people's attention automatically, and then I think it will focus more on, okay, what does this really mean? A final point, though, on that is, you know, all politics is local here as well as in Afghanistan, and I think. It was mentioned already, the Constitution calls for municipal elections that haven't happened. It calls for district council elections that haven't happened. You know, the sooner those happen, the better for people's understanding of the process and their feeling of ownership in the democratic process. So while it won't be necessarily in 2014, you're talking about district councils potentially in 2015. You know, having Afghans participate more locally in democratic processes whenever it's possible will also, I think, help reinforce what does this mean for me, and then how do I know whether a process is fair or not.
Let me make one very brief final comment, because we deliberately decided to have 2 panels on the international role, in part because of international fatigue, largely, that we're leaving in 2014. And we internationals also have the most to learn, in some sense, from the last 10 years. That being said, I often, you know, when you're a moderator, you can allow your mind to wander. And I often have a thought experiment of what if the U.S., after 30 years of war, was being rescued by a group of Afghans who were going to help us put our society back together again. And me, as an American, attend a conference, listening to some Afghans, many who may not even speak English, describing how my society is, and how it should be put together, and what the incentives are, and so forth. And it's a very awkward feeling. So to all of our Afghan friends who came here today, or who might have listened on the webcast, I want to thank you for your forbearance. That being said, I do think that both earlier today and now we've come up with an excellent and very knowledgeable group of panelists, and I hope it's been useful and rich for you, and that it will have some impact on, again, trying to get the most that we can out of these next 2 years, so that we leave behind an Afghanistan that is more than stable, but that is also fulfills some of the other ambitions that Afghans set for themselves 11 years ago, almost exactly to the day in Bonn. So thank you very much for coming. And thank you, panelists.